We tend to think of human history as something that started recently, something that matters because it's immediate, because it affects us. We think of our species, Homo sapiens, as the pinnacle of evolution, the end point of millions of years of development, the moment when nature finally got it right. We've been around for maybe 300,000 years, which sounds like an enormous amount of time until you realize it isn't. Not really. Because there was another species before us, another branch of our family tree that didn't just survive for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. It survived for nearly 2 million years. 2 million years of existence, of adaptation, of success so complete and so sustained that it makes our entire history look like a brief, frantic moment in time. That species is Homo erectus. And when you really understand what that means, when you grasp the full weight of what it took to survive that long, in a world constantly changing, constantly challenging, killing everything that couldn't adapt fast enough, something shifts in how you see yourself and your place in the history of life on Earth. We haven't been here long at all. In fact, we're barely getting started. The question that should be keeping you up at night is simple. If we've only been around for 300,000 years, if we're still so young as a species, what makes us think we'll still be here in another 2 million? What did Homo erectus know that we don't? What did they do right that we might be doing wrong? Because their story isn't just history. It's a warning and an inspiration all at once. A reminder that longevity in this world takes more than just being smart. It takes adaptability, flexibility, the ability to change when the world demands it. Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing people from Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime. All at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries about our ancestors, about where we came from, about whether we have what it takes to last. Here's what's remarkable about Homo erectus. These species existed for somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million years. Let me say that again because the numbers are so large they lose meaning. For between 1,500,000 and 2 million years, one continuous species of human-like being walked the earth. That's not a geological blink. That's not a brief moment in time before something better came along. That's a dynasty of existence so long that it encompasses entire epochs of climate change, environmental upheaval, the rise and fall of other species, the transformation of continents. Homo erectus first appeared around 2 million years ago, probably in Africa, probably descended from earlier hominins like Homo habilis, and they didn't disappear until around 500,000 years ago, though the exact timeline is debated by scientists who are still finding new fossils and redating old ones with better techniques. But in between, something extraordinary happened. This species didn't just survive, it conquered. By the standards of human evolution, Homo erectus was an overwhelming success. Think about what was required for this kind of persistence. Your survival as a species depends on your ability to adapt to an infinite number of changing circumstances. The climate shifts, the food sources disappear, new predators emerge, diseases spread, competitors arrive. Any one of these challenges could end everything. But Homo erectus faced all of them and survived. The fossil evidence tells us that these beings spread out of Africa almost immediately after their evolution. The earliest known examples appeared in Georgia, in the Caucasus Mountains between Europe and Asia, around 1.8 million years ago. The species called Homo erectus georgicus. These weren't tentative explorers poking their heads out of Africa to see what was there. These were populations that travelled far from home and then settled in new environments, started families, built communities. They didn't go back. They stayed. and within a few 100,000 years Homo erectus had established populations across Asia, in Indonesia, in China, in the Middle East. Later, they spread into Europe. Within less than 1,000,000 years of the species first appearing, they were living on multiple continents in radically different climates and environments. That's not just survival, that's conquest. What made this possible was that Homo erectus wasn't specialized. They weren't dependent on one food source or one environment like many species are. They could eat meat and plant foods. They could hunt large animals and gather smaller resources. They could live in tropical forests and semi-arid savannas and temperate zones. They could adapt their behavior to whatever resources were available. This flexibility is the real secret to their longevity. They were generalists in a world that often punishes specialists. Physically, they looked different from their predecessors in ways that mattered. Homo erectus had longer legs relative to their arms, compared to earlier hominins like Australopithecus. Those longer legs made them efficient walkers and runners. They could cover more ground in a day to find food, to escape predators, to explore new territories. They had shorter arms because they spent less time in trees, less time climbing. They were terrestrial creatures, built for walking upright across open landscape. Their bodies were taller and more heavily built than Homo habilis. This gave them strength, the ability to overpower game animals, to defend themselves against predators, and their brains were bigger. Not as big as modern humans, but substantially larger than earlier hominins, and showing a clear trend toward greater size over the 1,000,000 years the species existed. Early Homo erectus had brain volumes around 900 cubic centimeters. By the time the species was nearing its end, some individuals had brains approaching 1,200 cubic centimeters. That brain expansion happened gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, and each increase in brain size brought with it greater cognitive capacity, more sophisticated behavior, better problem solving. But brains require energy, and Homo erectus had to figure out how to feed those bigger brains. They did this by eating meat. The fossil evidence is clear. Homo erectus sites show the remains of large animals with cut marks left by stone tools, evidence of butchery. These beings were hunting or at least regularly accessing meat from large game. Mammoths, elephants, rhinoceroses, buffalo, other herbivores that weighed hundreds of pounds. Taking down these animals required coordination, planning, possibly the ability to communicate intentions and strategies to other hunters. Imagine what that must have been like. You're part of a hunting group, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 individuals, all with spears or clubs made from stone and wood. You've been tracking a mammoth for days. You know where it's headed, where it goes to drink water, where the herd tends to gather. You communicate with the other hunters without words, just gestures and sounds, everyone understanding what needs to happen. When the moment comes, you move simultaneously, surrounding the animal, driving it toward a ravine or a trapped area where it can't escape. It requires coordination at a level most animals simply can't achieve. But Homo erectus could do it. They could work together toward a goal. They could plan beyond the immediate moment. It required technology. And here Homo erectus innovated. They created hand axes. Stone tools worked on both sides into sharp cutting edges. These weren't crude rocks. They were sophisticated tools that required understanding how stone fractures, how to shape it, how to maintain an edge. But they also used them as multi-purpose devices, digging, scraping, cutting meat, preparing hides. A single hand axe could be employed in many different ways depending on what task needed doing. The earliest hand axes appear around 1.7 million years ago, and then continue being made essentially unchanged for over 1 million years. This incredible consistency in tool design across such an enormous span of time suggests something important. Homo erectus had culture. They had traditions passed down from generation to generation. Young individuals learned how to make hand axes by watching their elders. A master craftsperson would show a juvenile how to select the right stone, how to strike it at the correct angle, how to achieve the proper edge sharpness. The knowledge was embedded in practice, in demonstration, in repetition, until the student's hands understood the motions. Knowledge accumulated and was transmitted. This is the foundation of civilization, of any society that preserves information across time. Homo erectus figured it out long before writing, long before cities, long before agriculture. They had the core thing you need to build complexity. They had the ability to learn from each other across generations. And then they did something that may have been even more transformative. They controlled fire. The evidence for this is fragmentary, which is appropriate because fire from 1 million years ago doesn't leave easy traces. But archaeologists have found burned bones and ash in caves in South Africa dated to around 1 million years ago, in locations too deep in the cave to be explained by lightning strikes or natural fire. This ash and these burned bones suggest that Homo erectus brought fire into caves, controlled it, maintained it. Cooking food changes everything. When you cook meat, you make the proteins and other nutrients more bioavailable. Your digestive system can extract more energy from cooked food in less time. Your digestive tract can be shorter and more efficient. More energy is available for your brain, for reproduction, for everything else that keeps you alive. Fire also provides warmth. The ability to create heat allowed Homo erectus to survive in colder climates. Without fire, without the ability to warm themselves, they couldn't have spread into Europe or into higher altitude regions, where temperatures dropped seasonally. Fire provided protection from predators. Many large predators fear fire. Sitting around a fire at night made Homo erectus safer, and fire created a focal point for social gathering. People came together around the fire. They shared food, they told stories, they bonded. Communities formed and strengthened. Fire wasn't just technology, it was social glue. It enabled the kind of cooperation and group cohesion that allowed large populations to persist. What all of this added up to was a species that could adapt, that could change when circumstances demanded it. Homo erectus didn't remain unchanged for 2 million years. The fossil record shows gradual evolution, slightly larger brains over time, slightly different body proportions, different tool innovations in different regions. But these changes happened slowly, within the context of a persistent species identity. Homo erectus was not a static thing. It was a lineage, a population that changed but remained recognizably itself. This is the crucial difference between what Homo erectus achieved and what many other species fail at. Some species become so specialized, so finely tuned to one particular environment, that when that environment changes, they cannot adapt. They die out. But Homo erectus maintained enough flexibility to respond to environmental change without losing the core capabilities that made them successful. They were smart enough to innovate, but not so bound by their innovations that they couldn't abandon them if necessary. They were physical tough enough to survive harsh climates, but not so specialized for one climate that they couldn't exploit others. They were cooperative enough to sustain communities, but not so bound by rigid social structures that they couldn't reorganize when needed. Picture life as a Homo erectus individual around 1 million years ago. You were born into a small community of maybe 20 or 30 people, an extended family group. Your mother would have carried you for years, nursing you through early childhood. Your childhood lasted longer than it did for earlier hominins like Australopithecus. You had more time to learn from your parents and elders about where to find food, how to make tools, how to navigate the landscape, how to interact within the group, what plants were safe to eat, which animals were dangerous, how to predict seasonal changes. This extended childhood meant you could absorb more information, more cultural knowledge before you had to fend for yourself. You would watch your father or other adult males making hand axes, learning through observation and imitation, gradually developing the muscle memory and understanding of stone that came from years of practice. By your teenage years, you were already proficient with stone tools, already knew the migration patterns of game animals, because you'd travelled with the group for years and learned to read the landscape, already understood the social dynamics of your group and your role within it. As an adult, you hunted with other males in your group, travelling long distances following herds of animals across grasslands and into wooded areas. You knew how to read tracks in the mud, how to interpret behaviour of prey animals when they were likely to be in certain locations based on the season and the available vegetation. You knew how to work with other hunters to corner or exhaust large game, when to be quiet and when to make noise, how to predict where an animal would run and position yourself accordingly. You used fire to cook your meat, which made it easier to eat and digest and extracted more nutrition from it. You used fire to warm yourself on cold nights, sitting with your group around the flames, sharing the warmth and the cooked food. You used fire to make tools more efficiently by heating stone before striking it, a technique that made the stone easier to work and produced better tools. You possibly had some form of language, though whether it was as complex as modern human language is debatable. You certainly communicated ideas to other individuals through sounds and gestures. You made decisions collectively with other adults about where to move, when to hunt, how to organize hunts, how to handle disputes, how to respond to threats. You reproduced, had children who carried on you, our genes and your accumulated knowledge, who you taught the skills and knowledge that you had learnt from your parents. You aged and eventually died, and when you died, if you were fortunate, the community mourned you. Some Homo erectus sites show evidence of burial, of bodies placed carefully in graves, with some care taken in their positioning, suggesting emotional connection to the dead and ritual behaviour around death. The fact that people took the time to bury their dead carefully suggests they cared about each other, that death meant something, that there was mourning and respect for those who had passed. Now fast forward a few 100,000 years, Homo erectus populations have spread across multiple continents. They've adapted to different environments. In cooler regions, they've developed thicker bodies, more robust skeletons. In warmer regions, they remain slightly more gracile. Different populations develop regional variations in tool technology, creating distinct archaeological cultures. In some places, tools show rapid innovation, new styles emerging frequently. In other places, tool designs remain nearly identical for hundreds of thousands of years. Regional variation, local traditions, the expression of different cultures within a single species. This is what 2 million years looks like when distributed across multiple populations in different locations. It's not a single, linear history. It's thousands of overlapping lineages of people, each adapting to local circumstances, each passing knowledge down to their children, each contributing to the continuation of their species. The climate during the Homo erectus era was not stable. The Earth went through multiple glacial cycles. Ice ages came and went. During glacial periods, the climate in Europe cooled dramatically. Ice sheets advanced from the north, covering landscapes that had been temperate grasslands. Sea levels dropped as water locked in glaciers, exposing new land that could be walked across. During interglacial periods, the climate warmed again. Ice retreated back toward the poles, sea levels rose and inundated coastlines. These cycles happened over thousands of years, not quickly enough for immediate catastrophe, but fast enough that a single population might see dramatic changes within their lifespan. Forests expanded and contracted. Pine forests gave way to grasslands and then back again. Grasslands moved north and south following the climate. Animal populations shifted their ranges, following the vegetation that sustained them, and Homo erectus shifted with them. They moved into new territories during warm periods, expanding northward into Europe or into higher elevations that became habitable when temperatures rose. They retreated or adapted when cold returned. In some cases, populations that had moved north into colder regions would develop heavier, more robust bodies, better adapted to cold and shorter days. In other cases, they would simply move back south, following the animals they hunted. They survived the cycles not by remaining locked into one location, but by maintaining the flexibility to move, to change their diet, to innovate new strategies for hunting or gathering. They didn't have a detailed calendar or weather forecasts, no instruments to measure temperature or precipitation, but they could read the signs, they could see the seasons changing, understand what those changes meant for survival, make adjustments. A harsh winter that killed most of the game animals. The population would intensify plant gathering, focus on finding roots and berries and nuts. A warming period that brought new animals. They would modify their hunting strategies to deal with prey that required different approaches. This kind of observational flexibility, the ability to notice patterns and respond to them, this is what kept them alive through massive environmental fluctuations that killed other species. Other creatures became extinct because they were too specialized, too dependent on one food source or one climate range. But Homo erectus had learned to be generalists. They could eat anything. They could live anywhere, and that combination of adaptability, that's what allowed them to persist through epochs of change. And here's what's truly striking when you compare Homo erectus to our own species, Homo sapiens. We emerged around 300,000 years ago, probably also in Africa, probably from Homo erectus populations that continued evolving. But our emergence was recent, geologically speaking. Modern humans like you and me with the full suite of behavioral and cognitive capabilities we associate with our species, didn't appear until maybe 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. By that time we had large brains and sophisticated language and symbolic thought, and the ability to create art and complex social systems. All the things we associate with being human, we developed writing around 5,000 years ago, and that's when we think history really begins. But we've barely had time to settle into being a species. 300,000 years sounds like a long time, until you realize it's only 1/6 as long as Homo erectus managed. We're infants in comparison. We haven't faced the kinds of long-term challenges that Homo erectus had. We haven't survived multiple glacial cycles, at least not while maintaining coherent societies. We haven't had our populations cut off from each other for hundreds of thousands of years, and then had to figure out how to interact with each other again. We haven't had to continuously reinvent ourselves in response to environments that no human had ever encountered before because we moved so fast across the globe that we didn't stay in one place long enough for that. We've had technology and agriculture and written history and all these things that come with recent civilization, but that are actually quite fragile when you really examine them closely. Agriculture, for instance, appeared only about 10,000 years ago. It's new. It made civilization possible, but it also made us dependent on specific plants and animals, on land, on the ability to predict seasons and plant at the right times. Cities appeared even more recently. Writing is just 5,000 years old. Our industrial civilization is only a couple hundred years old. All of these things are incredibly powerful and useful, but they're also dependent on complex systems working smoothly. Homo erectus didn't have any of those things. They didn't have cities or agriculture or writing or industry. They just had themselves. Their ability to think, to adapt, to cooperate, to teach, to learn, and they made it work for 2 million years. 2 million years without writing, without records, without permanent settlements, just people living and learning and transmitting knowledge and surviving through sheer flexibility and resilience. That's what should humble us when we think about our own species. What did Homo erectus know about persistence and adaptation that we seem to have forgotten? They knew that flexibility was more important than specialization. They didn't commit entirely to one way of life, or one location, or one food source in a way that locked them into certain behaviors. They kept multiple options open. If the animals they hunted disappeared because of climate change or migration patterns, they could gather plants. If a region became too cold or too dry for the plants they preferred, they could move to somewhere else or develop new food acquisition strategies. If a tool wasn't working effectively, they could invent a new one or modify the old design. They didn't have the rigid dogmatism that modern humans sometimes show, the insistence that things must be done one way, and one way only, because that's how we've always done it. They were pragmatic. They did what worked, and they were willing to change what worked if circumstances demanded it. There's wisdom in that approach. There's a kind of flexibility that we've actually lost in some ways through our specialization and our investment in complex systems. Homo erectus also seemed to understand the importance of knowledge transmission. They maintained tool technologies across hundreds of thousands of years because they took the time to teach them to younger individuals. A master toolmaker would show apprentices the precise technique for creating a hand axe. The knowledge would be transmitted through the practice, through repetition, through the younger generation learning by doing. They preserved innovations by passing them down. A clever individual would develop a new tool or a new hunting technique. Instead of keeping it secret, they would teach it to others. It would spread through the population. They accumulated knowledge across generations. Cultural evolution, the improvement of techniques and ideas over time through transmission and modification. This was happening in Homo erectus populations. It's one of the things that made them so successful. They weren't just genetically passing down instincts. They were culturally passing down information, and information is power. Information is what allows adaptation. Information is what turns a clever individual into a clever species. And the remarkable thing is that Homo erectus figured this out without writing, without any technological aids to memory. They just understood that knowledge was valuable and that it needed to be preserved and transmitted. That's why they lasted so long. The thing that makes Homo erectus truly remarkable, though, isn't just that they lasted so long. It's that they lasted so long while continually changing. Evolution didn't stop for Homo erectus. Their brains got bigger over the million years of the species' existence. Their bodies changed. Their tool technology evolved. Their behavior became more sophisticated. But all of this happened gradually, within the context of them remaining recognizably Homo erectus, maintaining continuity of identity while still adapting to new circumstances. That's an almost impossible balance to strike. You have to be stable enough to maintain your identity as a species, to have continuity across generations, but flexible enough to change when circumstances demand it. You have to preserve what works while being willing to abandon what doesn't. You have to trust your traditions but not become enslaved by them. Homo erectus managed this for 2 million years. It's one of the greatest achievements in the history of life on Earth. And we've been here less than 1/6 as long. There's something humbling about understanding this history, We look at our species and see this explosion of intelligence, this capability for complex thought, this ability to transform our environment and build civilizations and leave marks on the world that will last for centuries. We think that intelligence is the ultimate evolutionary advantage, that having big brains and symbolic language and written records means we're more successful, more advanced, better than everything that came before. But Homo erectus shows us that's not necessarily true. They weren't as smart as we are. Their societies weren't as complex. They didn't have art or writing or philosophy. But they had something more fundamental. They had the ability to keep going, generation after generation after generation, through climate changes that would have destroyed other species, through environmental challenges that required constant innovation and adaptation, through the simple, brutal test of time. They didn't create civilizations that lasted for thousands of years. They created a species that lasted for millions of years. Which is more impressive really depends on what you value. If you value accomplishment and innovation, and the ability to build elaborate structures and systems, then modern humans win. We've built pyramids and cities and technologies that Homo erectus could never have imagined. But if you value persistence, if you value the ability to survive long-term challenges without losing your core identity, if you value the kind of adaptability that comes from not being too specialized, too rigidly committed to one way of living, then Homo erectus achieved something greater. They showed that it's possible to last. That species don't have to burn bright and die quickly. They can slow burn across millions of years if they maintain the right balance between stability and flexibility. If you're still awake and listening, if this hasn't put you to sleep yet, think about what our own future might hold. We have 300,000 years of Homo sapiens history behind us. We have maybe 10,000 years of civilization. We've been able to extract knowledge from the earth, build complex societies, create technologies that extend far beyond what our biological bodies can do. But we've also become dependent in ways that Homo erectus never was. We depend on complex supply chains and infrastructure and energy systems. We depend on written records and electronic storage of information. We depend on agriculture and trade and economic systems that have only existed for a few thousand years. These things are powerful, but they're also fragile. They require constant maintenance. They can fail. Homo erectus, in contrast, depended on something simpler and more robust. They depended on their own capability to learn and adapt. They depended on knowledge that was embedded in culture, in practices, in traditions. That knowledge was harder to destroy. It was distributed across many individuals and communities. If one group lost the knowledge, another group could still maintain it. If one innovation failed, they could develop something different. They were resilient in ways that modern civilization often isn't. So what should you take from all of this? Maybe just the reminder that human history isn't what we usually think it is. We tend to focus on the last few thousand years, on recorded history, on civilization and culture, and all the things we've written down and built. But the real history of our species goes back much further. Our ancestors survived for millions of years before any of this. They survived ice ages and extinctions and all the random cruelty of a world that doesn't care whether you succeed or fail. And they did it through nothing more sophisticated than the ability to think and adapt and teach each other. If you've listened this far, if you've travelled with me through this history of our deepest ancestors, do me a favour. Comment and let me know where you're listening from. Are you somewhere that Homo erectus once walked? In Africa, where our species was born? In Asia or Europe, where they spread and adapted and thrived? Or somewhere that modern humans have taken over, building cities and civilizations in places where earlier human species once roamed? Your location is part of this story. You're descended from beings who survived 2 million years of challenges. You carry in you the adaptability and resilience that got us here. Hit that subscribe button if you want to explore more of human history with me, because there are deeper stories to tell, stranger mysteries to uncover, forgotten chapters that need to be remembered. And if you're drifting off to sleep right now, let Homo erectus be your lullaby. Imagine them walking across grasslands in Africa, starting fires against the night, teaching their children how to make tools, passing down knowledge through the generations. Imagine them spreading across the world, adapting to forests and mountains and colder climates, learning as they went. Imagine them surviving ice ages and extinctions and all the random challenges that the Earth threw at them. For 2 million years they persisted. For 2 million years they adapted. And then they faded, replaced by newer species that continued the human story. But they proved something fundamental. They proved that it's possible to last, that with the right balance of stability and flexibility, with knowledge passed down through generations, with the ability to adapt when circumstances demand it, with the willingness to change without losing your core identity, that anything can persist, that life can go on, that we have it in us to survive far longer than we think. Before we go any further, let's pause for a moment, because if you're still listening, if you didn't drift off already, then something important has happened. You've crossed a threshold in this story. We're no longer just talking about a prehistoric species. We're no longer cataloguing tools or bones or migration routes. We're standing in front of a mirror, and what we're really asking now is not what Homo erectus was, but what kind of species lasts, and whether we are built to be one of them. Homo erectus lived in a world without progress as an idea. There was no sense that tomorrow had to be better than today. No belief that history was moving somewhere. No expectation of improvement. Life did not have a direction beyond survival, reproduction, and continuity. And that absence, something we might instinctively see as a limitation, may have been one of their greatest strengths. Modern humans live almost entirely in the future. We plan. We predict. We worry. We imagine collapse before it arrives and success before it exists. We structure our societies around growth curves and projections and expectations that tomorrow must outperform today. Homo erectus did none of this, not because they were incapable of abstract thought, but because their environment didn't reward it. Their world changed slowly on the scale of a human lifetime, but relentlessly on the scale of generations. Ice advanced, ice retreated, forests became grasslands, grasslands became deserts, rivers shifted, coastlines moved, and the correct response to this kind of world is not long-term forecasting. It is attentiveness, it is pattern recognition, it is responsiveness without attachment. Homo erectus did not invest themselves in permanent futures. They did not anchor their identity to specific places, structures, or systems that had to persist unchanged. They moved when movement was required. They adapted when adaptation was demanded. They abandoned strategies that no longer worked without mourning them as losses. Their culture was portable. Their knowledge lived in people, not in places. And this brings us to something deeply uncomfortable when we compare them to ourselves. Because Homo erectus never built a civilization, not because they couldn't, but because doing so may have been unnecessary, or even dangerous, for the kind of world they inhabited. Civilization, as we understand it, requires stability, predictable seasons, reliable food production, fixed settlements, surpluses that can be stored, hierarchies that manage distribution. All of these things bind you to a place and to a set of assumptions about how the world will behave. They create efficiency but they also create fragility. Homo erectus lived through dozens of climate oscillations that would have shattered early agricultural societies. Entire ecosystems shifted within a few generations. Any species that locked itself too tightly to one strategy, one crop, one landscape, would have paid the price. But Homo erectus remained mobile. Their camps were temporary. Their shelters were adaptable. Their food sources were diverse. They did not overcommit. This is not romanticism. It is ecological realism. They avoided the trap of optimization. Optimization makes you very good at surviving under a narrow range of conditions. Flexibility makes you harder to eliminate when conditions change. Homo erectus chose flexibility. They were generalists in the deepest sense, not just in diet but in behavior. They did not need specific prey animals to survive. They did not rely on a single landscape type. They could hunt when hunting was possible and gather when hunting was not. They could move inland when coasts shifted. They could retreat south when cold advanced. They could expand north when warmth returned. Contrast this with modern humans. We have become specialists on a planetary scale. We have optimized our societies around stable climates, fossil fuels, global trade networks, just-in-time logistics, monoculture agriculture, and technologies that assume uninterrupted energy flows. These systems are extraordinarily powerful, but they're also tightly coupled. When one fails, others follow. Homo erectus did not build systems that could fail catastrophically. Their systems were simple, distributed, and redundant. Knowledge was not centralized. Tools were not rare. Skills were widespread. If one group failed, others survived. If one innovation was lost, another could be rediscovered. They did not scale fast. They scaled slowly, horizontally, across landscapes and generations. And this brings us to a quieter kind of intelligence, one that doesn't leave monuments behind. We often define intelligence by symbols: art, writing, mathematics, architecture. But Homo erectus shows us that there is another form of intelligence that operates beneath symbolism, an intelligence rooted in perception rather than abstraction. They knew landscapes intimately, not as maps, but as lived experience. They could read the ground, the vegetation, the behavior of animals, the movement of clouds, the smell of rain on dry soil. They understood cause and effect without formal models. They knew when to move, when to stay, when to risk, when to wait. This kind of intelligence does not fossilize well. You cannot dig it out of the ground. You cannot carbon date it. But you can infer it from outcomes, from the fact that they survived, from the fact that they expanded, from the fact that they adapted again and again without collapsing, and perhaps most strikingly, from the fact that they did all of this without visibly exceeding the ecological limits of their world. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus existed alongside other large animals without triggering mass extinctions. They hunted megafauna, yes, but not at a scale that destabilized ecosystems. They took what they needed and moved on. Their population densities were low. Their technologies did not amplify their impact beyond what ecosystems could absorb. They were apex problem solvers without becoming apex destroyers. This matters because when Homo sapiens appear later in the record, the pattern changes. Wherever modern humans go, extinctions tend to follow. Large animals disappear. Ecosystems reorganize rapidly. Landscapes change under sustained pressure. This is not because Homo sapiens are evil. It is because our cognitive and cultural acceleration allowed us to amplify our impact faster than ecological feedback could restrain us. Homo erectus never crossed that threshold. They existed below the level where intelligence becomes destabilizing, which raises an unsettling question. Is there a point at which intelligence stops being an advantage and becomes a liability? Homo erectus never built myths of dominance. They never believed the world existed for them. They lived within it. They responded to it. They did not attempt to remake it wholesale, and in doing so, they lasted longer than any other human species. Now, this does not mean they were static or stagnant. Over the course of their existence, Homo erectus changed. Their bodies evolved. Their brains grew. Their tools diversified slightly. Their behaviors became more refined. But this change happened at a pace that allowed ecosystems and social systems to adjust alongside it. They evolved without overshooting. They did not outrun their environment. And then, gradually, something new began to emerge from within them. Homo erectus populations did not vanish overnight. They did not suddenly go extinct in a single catastrophe. Instead, over hundreds of thousands of years, different populations began to diverge. Some adapted to colder climates, becoming more robust, developing traits that would later characterize Neanderthals. Others remained in Africa, continuing to evolve toward what we now recognize as Homo sapiens. Still others branched eastward, contributing to Denisovan lineages. There was no clear boundary, no moment where Homo erectus ended and we began. There were only transitions, gradual changes in anatomy, cognition, and culture layered over deep continuity. In that sense, Homo erectus never truly disappeared. They became us, and that realization should change how we think about extinction. Because when we say Homo erectus went extinct, what we really mean is that their form transformed, their genes flowed into new populations, their behaviors laid foundations, their survival strategies shaped what came next. They did not fail. They handed the future forward, and then Homo sapiens did something extraordinary. We accelerated. We began to innovate faster than biological evolution could keep up with. Culture started evolving at a speed that dwarfed genetic change. Tools became more complex. Social structures expanded. Language became richer. Symbolism exploded. Art appeared. Rituals formed. Identity became abstract. Within a remarkably short period, we went from small mobile groups to large, interconnected societies. We learned to manipulate plants and animals. We built permanent settlements. We stored surplus. We developed hierarchies. We externalized memory into symbols and writing. And in doing so, we traded some forms of resilience for others. We gained efficiency, scale, and power, but we lost simplicity. We lost redundancy. We lost the ability to walk away easily. Our survival became tied to systems rather than skills, to infrastructures rather than adaptability. Homo erectus carried their survival toolkit in their bodies and minds. We carry ours in machines, networks, and institutions, and that difference matters when we think about time. Because Homo erectus survived through slow change. We are now facing rapid change. Climate is shifting faster than many systems can adapt. Ecosystems are under strain. Technological change outpaces cultural integration. Social systems fracture under pressure. The very tools that grant us power also amplify our vulnerabilities. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that the lessons of Homo erectus are more relevant than we might like to admit. They remind us that survival is not about brilliance alone. It is about balance, about knowing when to advance and when to hold, when to innovate and when to preserve, when to specialize and when to remain flexible. They show us that longevity is not achieved by dominating the world, but by fitting within it. And perhaps the most important lesson they offer is this: no species is entitled to permanence. Homo erectus did not know they would last 2 million years. They did not aim for it. They simply lived in a way that allowed continuity. They responded to the world rather than trying to control it. They passed knowledge forward without needing monuments. They adapted without assuming they had reached a final form, and in doing so, they endured longer than any other human lineage. So if this story leaves you unsettled, that is appropriate. Because it should. We like to think of ourselves as the culmination of human evolution, but Homo erectus reminds us that we are an experiment still in progress, young, powerful, and untested across the timescales that truly matter. If you are drifting towards sleep now, let this final image settle gently. Imagine a small group of Homo erectus gathered around a fire on the African savanna. The night is quiet. Predators keep their distance. The firelight flickers across faces shaped differently than ours, but eyes just as aware. Children sit close to adults. Tools rest nearby. Knowledge is not written down, but it is alive, held in memory, ready to be passed on tomorrow. They do not know the future. They do not need to. They only need to live well enough that the next generation can do the same. And for 2 million years that was enough. If you are still listening, then let us move even farther back. Not in time, but in perspective. Because the story of Homo erectus does not end with their endurance or their quiet success. It expands outward into something broader and more unsettling. Their existence forces us to confront a question we rarely ask honestly. Not how intelligent a species can become, but how much intelligence a world can tolerate. For most of Earth's history, life evolved under constraints that rewarded balance. Energy was limited, resources were finite, ecosystems punished excess. Any organism that grew too specialized, too dependent, too aggressive toward its own environment eventually paid the price. Extinction was not an anomaly. It was the default outcome. Against this backdrop, Homo erectus stands out not because they escaped extinction forever, but because they delayed it longer than anyone else. They existed through geological patience. And patience, it turns out, may be one of the rarest evolutionary traits. We often imagine evolution as a ladder, each rung more advanced than the last. But in reality, evolution is a branching process governed by trade-offs. Every advantage carries a cost. Bigger brains consume more energy. Social complexity requires coordination. Tool use demands learning and transmission. Language requires shared symbols. Each step forward opens new possibilities while quietly narrowing others. Homo erectus occupied a rare equilibrium point. Their brains were large enough to support foresight, cooperation, and innovation, but not so large that cognition became a runaway process. Their social groups were complex enough to share knowledge and coordinate action, but small enough to remain flexible. Their technologies were powerful enough to shape environments locally, but not powerful enough to destabilize ecosystems globally. They lived beneath several invisible thresholds we would later cross. One of the most important of these thresholds is symbolic abstraction. Homo erectus almost certainly communicated with structured vocalizations. Their brains and anatomy suggest a proto-language, perhaps not fully symbolic, but capable of conveying intent, warning, coordination, and basic narratives. But there is little evidence they engaged in the kind of symbolic explosion seen later in Homo sapiens. They did not leave behind cave art. They did not carve figurines. They did not bury their dead with grave goods. They did not externalize meaning into objects in ways we can easily recognize. And this absence matters. Symbolic thinking allows a species to transcend immediate reality. It allows stories, myths, identities, and imagined futures to shape behavior. It allows cooperation at scale, across kinship lines. It enables religion, ideology, and large social institutions. But it also allows belief to outrun evidence. It allows narratives to persist even when they no longer align with reality. Homo erectus appears to have lived closer to the feedback loops of the natural world. Their beliefs, whatever they were constrained by direct experience. If a strategy failed, it was abandoned. If a place became unviable, it was left. If a resource disappeared, alternatives were sought. There was little room for dogma, little room for rigid ideology, little room for systems that demanded reality conform to belief rather than the other way around. This may be one of the reasons their cultural evolution was slow, but it may also be one of the reasons it was stable. When Homo sapiens began to lean heavily into symbolic abstraction, something changed. Culture became cumulative at an accelerating rate. Innovations stacked rapidly. Knowledge compounded across generations. Technologies improved faster than environments could respond. This was not a flaw. It was a breakthrough. But every breakthrough comes with consequences. Symbolic abstraction allowed us to imagine gods, nations, money, laws, and futures that did not yet exist. These imagined constructs allowed cooperation among strangers and the coordination of massive projects. They also allowed the justification of exploitation, domination, and ecological overshoot. Homo erectus never imagined themselves as rulers of the earth. They did not conceptualize nature as something to be conquered. They were participants, not managers. And participation creates a fundamentally different relationship with the world. When you see yourself as embedded in an ecosystem rather than above it, your strategies change. You avoid pushing systems to their limits because you cannot escape the consequences. You do not extract beyond renewal because collapse is immediate and personal. You do not build structures that require perpetual growth because stagnation does not equal failure. Homo erectus lived in a world without the illusion of infinite expansion. We do not. And this brings us to another quiet but profound difference. Time perception. Homo erectus lived in deep time without knowing it. Their lives were shaped by cycles rather than trajectories. Seasons returned, herds migrated, fires burned and regrew. Children became adults who raised children in much the same way. Change happened, but slowly enough to feel continuous. Modern humans live in compressed time. We measure progress in years, quarters, even seconds. We expect rapid transformation. We experience novelty constantly. Our environments shift within a single lifetime more dramatically than Homo erectus experienced across dozens of generations. This affects cognition. Fast-changing environments reward short-term optimization. They encourage rapid innovation, specialization, and risk-taking. They also increase anxiety, competition, and instability. When systems change faster than cultural norms can adapt, stress accumulates. Homo erectus lived below this stress threshold. Their nervous systems evolved in a world where uncertainty existed but not at overwhelming speeds. Their problems were immediate and tangible: hunger, predators, weather, injury. They did not face abstract threats like financial collapse, existential risk, or global climate models. Their stresses were acute, not chronic. And chronic stress changes a species. It alters behavior, social dynamics, decision-making, and long-term planning. It encourages hoarding, aggression, and short-sightedness. It makes cooperation fragile. One could argue that Homo erectus avoided chronic stress by living within narrower cognitive horizons. They did not carry the weight of imagined futures. They did not anticipate catastrophes centuries ahead. They responded to the present. This does not mean they were unintelligent. It means their intelligence was calibrated to their environment. And calibration is everything. Now consider what happened when Homo erectus populations began to fragment and differentiate. As groups spread into diverse environments, cold Eurasian steppes, temperate forests, tropical regions, their bodies adapted. Some became stockier, some developed different facial structures, some adapted to lower sunlight levels. Over time, these adaptations accumulated. This is where the neat categories we use, erectus, heidelbergensis, neanderthalensis, sapiens, begin to blur. These were not discrete species marching in single file. They were overlapping populations exchanging genes, technologies, and behaviors. Homo erectus was not replaced. They were absorbed, transformed, diversified. Their legacy did not end, it dispersed. And yet, something about Homo sapiens set us on a divergent path. Our symbolic capacity crossed a threshold. Our social networks expanded beyond immediate kin. Our tools began to reshape landscapes at increasing scales. Our cultural evolution began to outpace biological checks. We became ecological engineers, and engineering introduces a new dynamic: responsibility. Homo erectus did not need to manage planetary systems. We do. But our instincts were shaped long before such responsibility existed. We evolved to respond to local feedback, not global signals, to care about immediate groups, not abstract populations, to prioritize short-term survival over long-term stability when forced to choose. This mismatch between evolved instincts and modern scale is one of the defining challenges of our species. Homo erectus never faced it. Their scale remained human, their impact remained local, their feedback loops remained tight, and this is why studying them matters now more than ever. Not because we should romanticize their lives or wish to return to them, but because they represent a form of success that does not rely on domination, acceleration, or expansion. They represent endurance without excess. They show that it is possible to survive for immense spans of time without exhausting the systems that support you. They remind us that technological restraint can be as adaptive as innovation. That cultural simplicity can coexist with cognitive sophistication. That longevity is not always visible in monuments, but in continuity. As we move deeper into the future, Homo erectus becomes less a fossil species and more a reference point. A reminder that being advanced is not the same as being sustainable. A reminder that intelligence without restraint can become self-defeating. A reminder that adaptation is not about winning quickly, but about not losing eventually. And perhaps the most humbling lesson they offer is this: they did not know they were special. They did not know they were extraordinary. They did not know they would outlast every other human lineage. They simply lived in a way that worked. And that may be the most advanced strategy of all. So as this story continues, beyond Homo erectus, beyond the emergence of modern humans, beyond agriculture, cities, and civilizations, keep this quiet benchmark in mind. 2 million years, no empires, no writing, no machines, no monuments, just survival, adaptation, and continuity. Not because they aimed for greatness, but because they avoided collapse. And in a universe where most things end quickly, that may be the rarest achievement imaginable. We will continue. Because the moment Homo sapiens steps fully into the picture, the pace changes, the stakes rise, and the experiment becomes far more volatile. When Homo sapiens finally steps into the foreground of this story, the tempo shifts almost immediately, not abruptly, not with a single invention or a single migration, but with a subtle acceleration that never truly slows again. At first, the differences are easy to overlook. Early Homo sapiens hunted, gathered, used stone tools, controlled fire, and lived in small groups, much like their predecessors. If you watch them from a distance, across a valley or a shoreline, they would not seem radically different from late Homo erectus or early Neanderthals. But beneath the surface, something new was taking shape. A cognitive pressure, a tendency toward accumulation, an instinct not just to adapt to environments but to reorganize them. Where Homo erectus existed within landscapes, Homo sapiens began to narrate them, and narration changes everything. Stories allow experience to travel farther than memory. They compress lessons across generations. They turn isolated events into shared meaning. They create continuity beyond the individual. Over time, stories harden into traditions, traditions into norms, norms into identities. Identity, once formed, becomes powerful and dangerous, because identity resists change even when conditions demand it. Homo erectus adapted quickly because they did not carry heavy cultural frameworks. Homo sapiens, once symbolic culture took hold, became slower to abandon ideas, even failing ones, because those ideas were no longer just strategies, they were beliefs. This is where the trajectory begins to bend. The archaeological record shows a gradual but unmistakable increase in symbolic behavior. Pigments, personal ornaments, intentional burials, abstract markings. None of these innovations were strictly necessary for survival, but all of them served a different function. They created shared reality. Shared reality allows large groups to coordinate beyond immediate relationships. It allows trust among strangers. It allows division of labor at scale. It allows specialization. It allows complexity. It also introduces fragility. Complex systems depend on many interlocking parts. When one fails, others may cascade. Small disruptions can amplify. Feedback loops grow longer and harder to perceive. Homo erectus lived in systems where cause and effect were closely coupled. Homo sapiens began to stretch those distances. At first, this was an advantage. Groups that shared knowledge more effectively outcompeted others. Better tools, better coordination, better strategies led to expansion. Homo sapiens spread rapidly across continents, reaching environments no previous hominin had occupied. But expansion carries momentum. Once a population grows beyond local carrying capacity, it must continue expanding or innovate intensively to sustain itself. Either path increases complexity. Either path increases dependence on systems that must be maintained. This is the beginning of what some researchers call the complexity trap. Each solution creates new problems that require further solutions. Each innovation increases reliance on other innovations. Eventually, survival depends not just on environmental conditions, but on the continued functioning of social, technological, and symbolic systems. Homo erectus never entered this trap. Homo sapiens walked into it slowly, without realizing the door was closing behind them. Consider fire. Fire use existed long before Homo sapiens. Homo erectus likely mastered it over 1 million years ago. But for erectus, fire was a tool, a localized technology used for warmth, protection, cooking, and social gathering. For Homo sapiens, fire became infrastructure. It enabled landscape modification. Controlled burns reshaped ecosystems. Later, kilns, furnaces, and metallurgy emerged. Fire moved from the camp to the production chain. It became embedded in survival itself. With each step, dependence increased. The same pattern appears with tools. Stone tools existed for millions of years with relatively slow change. Homo sapiens accelerated tool innovation dramatically. New forms appeared more frequently. Composite tools, projectile weapons, and later mechanical devices increased efficiency and reach. Efficiency, however, is not neutral. Efficient systems extract resources faster. They allow populations to grow beyond what slower methods would support. Growth increases demand, which pressures systems further. This feedback loop, efficiency leading to growth leading to dependency, becomes self-reinforcing. Homo erectus lived below this loop. Homo sapiens became caught within it. Nowhere is this more visible than in the transition to agriculture. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived as foragers. Diverse diets, mobility, and flexible social structures kept populations relatively small and resilient. When conditions deteriorated, groups moved or adapted. Agriculture changed the equation. By domesticating plants and animals, humans decoupled food production from immediate environmental variability. This allowed population density to increase dramatically. It also anchored people to specific locations. Sedentism brought storage. Storage brought surplus. Surplus brought inequality. Inequality brought hierarchy. Hierarchy brought power. Power brought conflict. This sequence was not inevitable in every detail, but its general contours appear again and again across regions and cultures. Agriculture solved the problem of food uncertainty. It created the problem of social instability. Homo erectus never stored surplus. They could not accumulate wealth. They could not hoard beyond what they could carry. As a result, inequality remained limited. Conflict existed, but it could not escalate indefinitely. Agricultural societies changed that balance. Once surplus exists, it can be controlled. Once controlled, it can be defended. Once defended, it can be fought over. The scale of violence increases, not because individuals become more violent, but because systems enable violence to persist beyond personal limits. Homo erectus conflicts were constrained by group size, mobility, and immediate consequences. Homo sapiens conflicts became abstracted, institutionalized, and prolonged. War became possible, not sporadic skirmishes but sustained campaigns fueled by stored energy, coordinated through symbols, justified by narratives. This represents another threshold crossed. And again, intelligence is not the problem. Scale is. As societies grow larger, feedback weakens. Decision-makers become separated from consequences. Actions taken in one place affect distant regions and future generations. Homo erectus decisions affected their immediate surroundings. Homo sapiens decisions ripple outward in space and time. This creates moral complexity. It also creates ecological risk. Large-scale agriculture reshaped landscapes. Forests were cleared. Soils were exhausted. Water systems were diverted. Species distribution shifted. Over time, biodiversity declined. None of this was malicious. It was emergent. The system rewarded short-term success over long-term stability. Those who expanded thrived. Those who restrained fell behind. This is the paradox Homo sapiens inherited. Our intelligence allows us to perceive long-term risks. Our social systems reward behaviors that generate them. Homo erectus did not face this contradiction. They did not need to regulate global systems. They did not need governance structures to restrain growth. Their lifestyles enforced limits automatically. As Homo sapien societies grew more complex, they attempted to manage these tensions through culture, law, and belief. Religions emerged that encoded ecological rules. Taboos limited overexploitation. Traditions regulated resource use. For a time, these mechanisms worked. But symbolic systems are vulnerable to reinterpretation. Beliefs can be bent. Rules can be overridden. When population pressure increases, restraint becomes costly, and costly restraint is rarely sustained indefinitely. The result is oscillation, periods of growth followed by collapse. civilizations rise, flourish, strain their environments, and decline. This pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across history. Homo erectus did not experience civilizational collapse. They experienced local failures, yes, but not systemic breakdowns spanning continents. Their simplicity insulated them. Their lack of accumulation protected them. Their limited scale preserved feedback. As we move closer to the present, the pace accelerates further. Industrialization multiplies energy access dramatically. Fossil fuels unlock stored sunlight accumulated over millions of years. Productivity explodes. Population surges. Technology evolves faster than social norms. For the first time, a single species begins to alter planetary systems, climate, oceans, atmospheric chemistry, biogeochemical cycles. These are no longer abstract models. They are measurable changes unfolding in real time. Homo erectus never altered the Earth at this scale. Homo sapiens now must manage consequences no organism has ever faced before. And this brings us back to the quiet lesson embedded in erectus history. They did not rely on foresight to survive. We must. They did not need global coordination. We do. They did not face delayed feedback. We live within it. This does not mean Homo sapiens is doomed, but it does mean our challenge is unprecedented. We are the first species forced to consciously regulate its own success. The first forced to decide not just how to survive, but how much to expand. The first required to think on timescales longer than cultural memory. In this context, Homo erectus is not a primitive ancestor. They're a control case, a reminder of what human life looks like when intelligence remains embedded within ecological limits. They show us that longevity does not require domination, that complexity is optional, that survival can be quiet. As we continue forward, from early civilizations to modern global society, the contrast will sharpen further, because once symbolic systems, energy surpluses, and technological acceleration combine, the experiment enters its most unstable phase, and the outcome, for the first time, is uncertain. As the human experiment continues to accelerate, it begins to drift farther and farther away from the conditions under which the human mind originally evolved. This divergence is subtle at first, but it compounds relentlessly. Each generation inherits a world that is slightly more abstract, slightly more mediated, and slightly more detached from direct ecological feedback than the one before it. To understand why this matters, we need to slow down again. Not to Homo erectus this time, but to the environment that shaped all hominins before complexity took hold. For nearly the entirety of human evolutionary history, survival depended on reading the real world accurately. Misjudging weather patterns meant starvation. Misreading animal behavior meant injury or death. Overestimating resources meant collapse. Underestimating threats meant extinction. Reality was unforgiving, but it was also honest. The consequences of decisions arrived quickly, and they arrived personally. This created a tight coupling between perception and outcome. In such a world, intelligence evolves as a calibration mechanism. The mind becomes tuned to detect patterns that matter immediately. It becomes cautious where uncertainty is high and decisive where feedback is clear. Emotional responses, fear, curiosity, bonding, aggression, are shaped to optimize survival within narrow margins. Homo erectus lived entirely within this calibration window. Homo sapiens, gradually and then suddenly, moved beyond it. Symbolic systems allowed humans to construct layers of meaning that sat between perception and reality. Language did not merely describe the world, it reframed it. Stories selected which details mattered. Beliefs filtered which outcomes were acceptable. Over time, these symbolic layers thickened. Eventually, humans no longer interacted primarily with ecosystems. They interacted with representations of ecosystems. This is a critical shift. Once survival depends more on navigating social systems, economic structures, and abstract rules than on reading landscapes or seasons, selection pressures change. Traits that optimize symbolic success, persuasion, conformity, narrative coherence, status signaling, become more valuable than traits that optimize ecological accuracy. This does not eliminate intelligence, it redirects it. The mind becomes skilled at surviving within systems even when those systems drift away from reality. This is how civilizations persist long after their ecological foundations begin to erode. Collapse is delayed by abstraction. Warnings are muffled by narratives. Short-term stability masks long-term fragility. Homo erectus never had this buffer. They could not hide from consequences. Their lives were simpler, but their feedback loops were clearer. As Homo sapiens societies expanded, they increasingly relied on externalized systems to manage complexity. Writing preserved information beyond memory. Bureaucracy coordinated large populations. Markets distributed resources. Laws enforced cooperation among strangers. Each of these innovations solved real problems. Each also increased dependence on structures that required maintenance. Over time, survival became less about adapting to nature and more about maintaining systems. And systems, unlike ecosystems, are brittle. They are optimized for specific conditions, they assume continuity, they resist change. When conditions shift beyond design parameters, systems fail abruptly. Ecosystems degrade gradually. This distinction matters. Homo erectus lived within ecosystems. Homo sapiens built systems, and systems scale. Once agriculture spread, human populations exploded. Cities emerged. Trade networks stretched across continents. Specialization increased productivity, but also reduced individual resilience. People no longer knew how to produce all necessities of life. They relied on others. Reliance is efficient. Reliance is also dangerous. When supply chains fail, consequences propagate rapidly. When governance falters, coordination breaks down. When trust erodes, cooperation collapses. Homo erectus societies were not immune to hardship, but their failures were localized. One group might perish while another survived nearby. Knowledge persisted through redundancy. Mobility allowed escape. In contrast, large-scale systems create synchronized risk. When a system collapses, millions can be affected simultaneously. This pattern repeats throughout history. Bronze Age collapses. The fall of empires. Population crashes tied to climate shifts. Soil exhaustion. Disease. Each time, complexity delayed recognition of the problem and amplified the consequences of failure. Yet each time, survivors rebuilt. Why? Because humans are adaptable, but adaptability has limits. And today, those limits are being tested at planetary scale. For the first time, human systems operate faster than many natural processes can recover. Carbon cycles measured in millennia are disrupted within centuries. Species extinction rates accelerate beyond background levels. Ocean chemistry shifts measurably within decades. These changes are not isolated, they interact. Climate affects agriculture. Agriculture affects biodiversity. Biodiversity affects ecosystem stability. Ecosystem stability affects human societies. The loops are no longer local, they are global, and the delay between cause and effect is long enough to obscure responsibility. This creates a psychological problem Homo erectus never faced. Delayed consequence erodes accountability. When actions do not produce immediate feedback, the mind struggles to connect behavior to outcome. This makes restraint difficult. It favors narratives that minimize risk or shift blame. Homo erectus could not deny reality. We can, and often do. But denial does not alter physical systems. It only delays response. The question then becomes, can a species evolved for immediate feedback learn to govern itself across deep time? Can intelligence that evolved to solve local problems adapt to managing planetary ones? This is not a question of morality. It is a question of evolutionary mismatch. Homo erectus avoided this mismatch by never crossing certain thresholds. They did not accumulate surplus beyond mobility. They did not externalize meaning into rigid symbols. They did not scale systems beyond direct comprehension. They did not accelerate faster than adaptation. Homo sapiens crossed all of these thresholds, and in doing so, we unlocked extraordinary capabilities, but also unprecedented risks. It is tempting to frame this as a choice between progress and restraint. That framing is misleading. The real challenge is calibration. Progress without feedback is dangerous. Restraint without understanding is fragile. What Homo erectus demonstrates is not that simplicity is superior, but that alignment matters. Their way of life aligned cognition, culture, and environment within stable bounds. Our task is to achieve alignment at a scale no organism has ever attempted. This requires something evolution did not fully prepare us for: conscious self-regulation. For most of life's history, regulation was automatic. Populations expanded until resources constrained them. Predators limited prey. Diseases checked growth. Extinction pruned excess. Humans circumvented many of these checks. Medicine reduced mortality. Agriculture increased carrying capacity. Technology insulated us from immediate scarcity. We became partially decoupled from natural regulation, but physics still applies. Energy flows still constrain. Ecological limits still exist. We have not escaped them. We have postponed their enforcement. Homo erectus never postponed enforcement. They lived within it. This is why their history feels strangely calm. No golden ages, no apocalyptic collapses, no exponential curves, just persistence. When we look back at them, it is easy to underestimate the achievement because it lacks drama. But drama is not a marker of success. Stability is. As Homo sapiens moves deeper into the Anthropocene, we face a paradox. Our intelligence allows us to understand the risks we have created. But understanding alone does not guarantee behavioral change. Knowledge does not automatically override incentives. Systems reward growth. Markets reward extraction. Politics rewards short-term gains. Individuals operate within structures they did not design and cannot easily change. This creates a collective action problem of unprecedented scale. Homo erectus did not need collective action beyond the group. We need it globally, and yet our psychology remains tribal. Our empathy attenuates with distance. Our concern fades with abstraction. This is not a moral failing. It is an evolved constraint. Recognizing this constraint is essential, because solutions that ignore human nature tend to fail. Homo erectus solutions worked because they required no global coordination. They were embedded in lifestyle. In contrast, modern solutions often rely on complex agreements, sustained cooperation among strangers, and delayed benefits. These are fragile. They require trust, transparency, and enforcement. They require cultural narratives that align self-interest with long-term stability. In other words, they require symbolic systems to correct the problems created by symbolic systems. This is the complexity trap in its final form. We must use the tools that caused the problem to solve it. language, institutions, stories, beliefs. Homo erectus avoided this recursion entirely. They did not need meta-solutions. They lived within limits that enforced themselves. This does not mean we can return to their way of life. The world has changed. Population has grown. Knowledge has accumulated. Technology cannot be uninvented. The question is not whether we can go back. It is whether we can go forward without overshooting irreversibly. In this sense, Homo erectus offers not a blueprint but a boundary condition. They show us that human existence does not require perpetual acceleration. That meaning does not require endless novelty. That survival does not require domination. They remind us that the most dangerous assumption a species can make is that its current trajectory is inevitable. Nothing in evolution is inevitable. Homo erectus endured because their way of life dampened extremes. Ours amplifies them. Whether amplification leads to transformation or collapse depends on whether feedback is restored before thresholds are crossed, and thresholds once crossed do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves only after recovery becomes difficult. This is where the story continues, because after Homo sapiens spreads, builds, accelerates, and reshapes the planet, the question is no longer about origins. It is about continuity, about whether intelligence can coexist with restraint, about whether foresight can overcome momentum, about whether a species capable of imagining the future can choose to remain part of it. If we continue this thread forward, we reach an uncomfortable realization that most discussions of human progress quietly avoid. Evolution does not reward intelligence in isolation. It rewards fitness within a given environment. Intelligence is only advantageous when it produces behaviors that keep a population within survivable bounds. When intelligence enables a species to temporarily bypass limits without removing those limits, it creates a delayed reckoning rather than a permanent escape. This is the phase Homo sapiens is now entering. For most of our history, cultural evolution moved faster than biological evolution, but still slow enough that consequences arrived within a few generations. Agricultural mistakes led to soil exhaustion within centuries. Overhunting reduced game populations within lifetimes. Deforestation altered rainfall patterns within decades. These were long-term problems, but not abstract ones. Communities could still feel them. What is new is scale. Today, the feedback loops span continents and centuries. Actions taken in one region alter conditions globally. Emissions accumulate invisibly. Extinctions compound quietly. Thresholds are crossed without immediate sensory cues. The human nervous system did not evolve to register danger at this temporal or spatial distance. Homo erectus never faced this problem. Their actions were constrained by immediate cost. If they overexploited an area, they felt hunger. If they stayed too long, resources dwindled. Mobility was both a necessity and a solution. The landscape itself enforced balance. Modern humans replaced landscapes with ledgers, maps, models, and projections. These tools are powerful, but they abstract away lived experience. When risk is translated into numbers, it loses emotional urgency. When danger is framed as probability, it competes poorly against certainty of short-term reward. This creates a fundamental tension between what we know and what we do. We know ecosystems are fragile. We know climate systems have tipping points. We know overconsumption is unsustainable. Yet behavior changes slowly. Not because humans are irrational, but because evolution shaped us to prioritize immediate local signals over distant diffuse ones. This is why the comparison to Homo erectus matters so deeply. They did not need to consciously restrain themselves. Their environment did it for them. Their cognition evolved within a closed loop of action and consequence. We live in an open loop. The danger of open loops is not instant collapse. It is gradual drift. Drift toward normalization of excess. Drift toward systems that assume infinite growth. Drift toward narratives that equate expansion with success. Drift toward dependency on technologies that mask underlying instability. At first, drift feels like progress. Standards of living freeze. Convenience increases. Complexity becomes invisible. But drift continues even when the underlying conditions no longer support it. This is how civilizations overshoot, not through ignorance but through delayed correction. The archaeological record is full of examples. Societies that mastered their environment so effectively that they exhausted it. Irrigation systems that salinize soil. Forests cleared beyond recovery. Fisheries collapsed after centuries of abundance. Each case followed a similar pattern: innovation, expansion, confidence, denial, collapse. What differentiates the present moment is that the system under stress is not regional, it is planetary. There is no untouched hinterland to retreat into, no new continent to discover, no ecological margin large enough to absorb global failure. Homo erectus always had margins. We are rapidly consuming ours. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that the margin for error is shrinking, and shrinking margins demand precision. Precision in policy, precision in coordination, precision in understanding feedback, precision in aligning incentives with long-term outcomes. Precision is difficult for systems built on speed. Modern civilization values acceleration, faster production, faster communication, faster consumption, faster decision-making. Speed creates competitive advantage. Slowness is penalized, but adaptation, the kind that sustains species across millennia, is inherently slow. Homo erectus adapted across thousands of generations. They did not optimize for maximum short-term gain. They optimized for survivability. Their pace matched the environment's ability to recover. Ours does not. This mismatch is not philosophical. It is physical. Energy extraction increases entropy. Material throughput depletes finite stocks. Waste accumulates. No narrative can change thermodynamics. No ideology can negotiate with chemistry. At some point, systems must reconcile with physical reality. The open question is whether reconciliation happens through deliberate adjustment or enforced correction. Homo erectus experienced enforced correction continuously, but gently, because their scale was small. Our corrections, if enforced, will be abrupt. This is the cost of delay. Yet there is another dimension where Homo erectus offers insight, one that is often overlooked: social cohesion. Their groups were small but tightly bonded. Cooperation was not optional. Reputation mattered. Free riding was visible. Cheating carried immediate consequences. Survival required trust. Modern societies rely on anonymous cooperation. We depend on strangers for food, energy, safety, and information. This is a remarkable achievement, but it also weakens accountability. When harm is distributed across millions, responsibility dissolves. No single individual feels culpable. This creates moral diffusion. Homo erectus lived without diffusion. Every action had a face. This matters because large-scale coordination depends on trust. Trust depends on perceived fairness. Fairness depends on transparency. Transparency is difficult in complex systems. When trust erodes, cooperation falters. When cooperation falters, systems destabilize. This is not speculation. It is observable throughout history. Periods of stability correlate with strong social contracts. Periods of fragmentation correlate with inequality, opacity, and perceived injustice. Homo erectus did not have inequality in the modern sense. There were differences in strength, skill, and status, but material accumulation was limited by mobility. Hoarding was impractical. Power was constrained by proximity. Modern inequality operates differently. Resources accumulate abstractly. Power scales without physical presence. Consequences are externalized. This creates asymmetries Homo erectus never faced. A small number of actors can influence conditions for millions. This amplifies risk. Yet it also concentrates capacity. If alignment can be achieved at the top, change can propagate quickly. This is the paradox of scale. It increases fragility but also potential. The future of Homo sapiens depends on whether our symbolic intelligence can finally close the feedback loop that biology no longer enforces automatically. This means designing systems that make long-term consequences visible. That reward restraint rather than excess. That value resilience over efficiency. Efficiency minimizes waste under stable conditions. Resilience absorbs shocks under unstable ones. Homo erectus lived in an unstable world. They were resilient by necessity. We optimized for efficiency during a brief period of climatic stability. That period is ending. As conditions become more volatile, efficiency becomes liability. Just-in-time systems fail when supply is disrupted. Monocultures collapse when stressed. Centralization magnifies failure points. Homo erectus intuitively avoided these traps. They diversified food sources. They distributed knowledge across individuals. They maintained mobility. They accepted variability as normal. We treated stability as permanent. This may be the most dangerous assumption of all. Stability in Earth's systems has always been temporary. The Holocene was an exception. We built everything on that exception. Now, as variability returns, our challenge is to reintroduce resilience without abandoning complexity. This is not a return to the past. It is an integration. The future does not belong to those who reject technology, nor to those who worship it. It belongs to those who understand limits. Homo erectus understood limits not intellectually but viscerally. We must understand them consciously. That is a heavier burden. Because conscious restraint requires collective agreement. It requires patience in a culture addicted to speed. It requires humility in a species accustomed to dominance. It requires remembering that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. Homo erectus survived because they fit within their world. We have reshaped the world to fit us. Now the world is responding. The final lesson of Homo erectus is not about tools or fire or migration. It is about proportion. They existed in proportion to their environment. They did not exceed it. If Homo sapiens can rediscover proportion at a global scale, then our 300,000 years may yet extend toward 2 million. If not, our story may be remembered the way we remember so many others in the fossil record. Brief, brilliant, and gone. And that is where the question truly rests, unresolved, stretching forward into a future that has not yet decided what kind of species we will ultimately prove to be. To understand where this path might lead, it helps to imagine the future not as a single outcome, but as a branching landscape of possibilities shaped by the same forces that shaped the past. Evolution does not move with intent. It responds, it selects, it filters, and it does so relentlessly, without regard for narratives of progress or meaning. Homo erectus did not know where they were going. They did not plan for 2 million years of survival. They simply lived in a way that allowed survival to continue. Selection did the rest. Their success was emergent, not designed. Modern humans, for the first time, are aware of selection pressures while still being subject to them. We can model outcomes, simulate futures, and project risks decades or centuries ahead. This awareness is unprecedented. But awareness alone does not grant immunity. In fact, awareness can create its own distortions. When futures are imagined abstractly, they compete with present realities. When risks are probabilistic, they struggle to motivate action. When threats are global, responsibility diffuses. This creates a strange paralysis. We know more than any species before us, yet struggle to act proportionally to that knowledge. Homo erectus had no such paralysis. Their responses were local, embodied, immediate. This difference may determine everything. As environmental volatility increases, selection pressures will intensify. Not necessarily through sudden catastrophe, but through gradual filtering. Regions that manage water scarcity effectively will stabilize. Those that do not will fragment. Societies that maintain trust will coordinate. Those that allow inequality and resentment to erode cohesion will struggle. Technologies that reduce dependency on fragile supply chains will proliferate. Those that increase dependency will become liabilities. In this sense, evolution has not stopped operating on humans. It has merely changed levels. Selection now operates on cultures, systems, and institutions as much as on genes. Civilizations that cannot adapt will decline. Those that can will persist. This process will not be clean or moral or fair. It never is. Homo erectus populations vanished region by region. Some lineages persisted while others disappeared. Survival was uneven. But the species endured because enough populations remained adaptable. The same principle applies now. Humanity does not need every system to succeed. It needs enough resilient ones to carry knowledge forward. This is where redundancy matters. Homo erectus survival depended on redundancy of skills. Many individuals knew how to hunt, how to make tools, how to find food. Knowledge was not centralized. Loss of one individual did not collapse the group. Modern societies centralize expertise. Specialization increases efficiency but reduces redundancy. When systems fail, few people know how to repair them. This creates a fragile equilibrium. Resilience requires reintroducing redundancy at scale. Distributed energy systems, local food production, decentralized knowledge, modular infrastructure. These are not regressions. They are adaptations to instability. They mirror patterns that have always worked in biological systems. Diversity increases survivability. Uniformity increases efficiency, but reduces adaptability. Homo erectus thrived through diversity of behaviors across regions. Different groups experimented independently. Innovations emerged in parallel. Failure in one area did not doom the species. Global homogenization removes this buffer. When everyone depends on the same systems, failure propagates rapidly. This is the danger of monoculture at planetary scale. Yet global connection also enables rapid learning. Failures can be observed and corrected elsewhere. Innovations can spread quickly. Again, scale cuts both ways. The outcome depends on whether learning outpaces degradation. This is the race we're now running. Not against time in the abstract, but against feedback delay. The longer feedback is delayed, the harder correction becomes. Homo erectus lived with minimal delay. We live with maximum delay. Closing that gap is the central challenge of modernity. This requires re-embedding humans within feedback-rich environments, even within technological systems. Real-time indicators of ecological health, economic incentives tied to long-term outcomes, Cultural narratives that value continuity over conquest. Narratives matter more than data. Homo erectus transmitted survival strategies through stories, demonstrations, rituals. These encoded practical knowledge emotionally. Modern humans rely heavily on abstract information, divorced from lived experience. To motivate change, information must become meaningful. It must connect to identity. It must feel personal. This is why stories endure longer than statistics. This is why Homo erectus culture worked without writing. The future will belong not to those with the most accurate models, but to those who can translate models into lived values. This is not a technological problem. It is a cultural one, and culture evolves slowly, but not as slowly as biology, which means there is still time. The window is narrow, but it exists. What Homo erectus teaches us above all is that survival does not require perfection. It requires sufficient alignment, enough adaptation, enough cooperation, enough humility to change course when the world changes. They did not dominate their environment, they listened to it. Modern humans have largely stopped listening. The signals are still there, but they are drowned out by noise. Restoring signal clarity is essential. This may involve discomfort, reduced consumption, slower growth, reprioritization of values. These are not popular ideas, but evolution has never cared about popularity. It cares about outcomes. If Homo sapiens can internalize this lesson, then our intelligence may yet become a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. If not, intelligence will simply become another trait filtered by selection, and life will continue indifferent. In deep time, species rise and fall. What remains are patterns. Homo erectus left a pattern of endurance. Homo sapiens is in the process of creating one of acceleration. Whether that pattern resolves into long-term persistence or brief intensity is still undecided. That decision will not be made in a single moment. It will be made through countless small choices, incentives, designs, and adaptations unfolding over generations. The future, like the past, will not announce itself clearly. It will emerge quietly, and one day, far from now, if another species looks back through layers of sediment and data, they will not judge us by our intentions. They will judge us by whether we lasted. Just as we now judge Homo erectus, not by what they built, but by how long they endured. As we bring this long arc to a close, it helps to step even farther back than human history itself, beyond Homo erectus, beyond Homo sapiens, and look at the broader pattern that governs all life on Earth. Because the story we've been circling is not only a human story, it is a biological one. Life persists not by winning once, but by remaining compatible with change. Every lineage that survives deep time does so by staying within a moving envelope of possibility. When environments shift slowly, life adapts slowly. When environments shift rapidly, only lineages with built-in flexibility endure. Those that overshoot, that extract too much, that specialize too narrowly, or that destabilize their own foundations, are removed. Not by malice, not by judgment, simply by physics and biology doing what they have always done. Homo erectus fits cleanly into this pattern. They did not bend the world to their will. They bent themselves, again and again, in small ways, over immense spans of time. They were shaped by the world more than they shaped it, and in that asymmetry lay their durability. Homo sapiens reversed the asymmetry. We shape the world faster than it shapes us. That reversal is the defining feature of our species, and it is both our greatest strength and our greatest risk. For a brief moment in geological time, shaping the world brought enormous rewards: stable climate, abundant energy, dense populations, cumulative knowledge, and unprecedented technological reach. But the moment is brief. The Earth system is vast, but not infinitely forgiving. When shaping outpaces understanding, when extraction outpaces regeneration, when complexity outpaces resilience, the curve eventually bends back. This is not collapse as spectacle, it is adjustment. And adjustment is rarely comfortable. What matters now is not whether humanity is intelligent enough to understand these dynamics. We already are. The real question is whether intelligence can overcome momentum, whether foresight can compete with incentive, whether long-term survival can matter more than short-term advantage. Homo erectus never faced this dilemma because they never had the power to destabilize the system they depended on. Limits enforced themselves. The environment corrected excess automatically. We remove those automatic corrections, which means the burden of regulation has shifted inward, onto culture, onto institutions, onto values, onto choices. This is new territory in the history of life. Never before has a species needed to consciously limit itself in order to survive. And yet that is precisely the position Homo sapiens now occupies. The tragedy is that restraint is evolutionarily counterintuitive. Selection favors expansion when resources allow it. It favors exploitation until feedback intervenes. But in a global system with delayed feedback, waiting for intervention may mean waiting too long. This is why Homo erectus matters so much as a mirror, not because we should emulate their lifestyle, but because they represent a mode of existence where survival emerged naturally from alignment. Their cognition, culture, and environment reinforced each other. Nothing had to be managed explicitly. Nothing had to be optimized aggressively. Nothing scaled beyond comprehension. They lived within a rhythm. We live on an exponential. Exponentials feel powerful until they break. The end of Homo erectus was not dramatic. There was no single extinction event, no final catastrophe. They faded gradually as new human forms emerged. Forms that carried forward many of their traits but added new ones. In some regions, Homo erectus likely interbred with their descendants. In others, they were replaced. The transition was uneven, messy, and largely invisible at the time. This is how most endings occur in evolution. Quietly, distributed, unnoticed by those living through them. That is worth remembering. If Homo sapiens were to fail, it would not look like a single apocalyptic moment. It would look like fragmentation, decline in some regions, persistence in others, loss of complexity, shrinking horizons, knowledge surviving in pockets, adaptation continuing under new constraints. Life would go on. Humans might go on. But the version of humanity that dominates today might not. This is not pessimism. It is realism informed by deep time, and deep time teaches humility. Homo erectus did not know their own significance. They did not know they would become one of the longest-lasting Hominian species in history. They did not know they were laying the groundwork for everything that came after. They simply lived in a way that worked, generation after generation. Their legacy is not monuments or myths. It is duration. That is the quiet metric evolution uses. Not brilliance, not creativity, not power, but persistence. As you sit with this story, perhaps drifting towards sleep, let that perspective settle. The human story is far older and far less centered on us than we often assume. We are a chapter, not the book, a phase, not the end point. What we do with this phase still matters, because unlike Homo erectus, we are aware. We can choose alignment, we can choose resilience, we can choose to value continuity over conquest. or we can continue accelerating and let selection decide. Either way, the process will unfold. The Earth will continue. Life will continue. The question is simply whether Homo sapiens will learn, in time, the same lesson Homo erectus embodied without ever needing to articulate it. That survival is not about pushing limits endlessly. It is about knowing when to stop and knowing how to adapt. If there is a comfort in this history, it is this: endurance does not require perfection. It requires balance, enough cooperation, enough flexibility, enough restraint to remain compatible with a changing world. Homo erectus proved that such balance is possible. For 2 million years, the rest of the story is now ours to write. Slowly, quietly, one generation at a time,